Hi, everyone. Welcome to Thanks for Sharing. I am your host, Jackie Pack. And before we get started with today's episode, I want to ask you to please hit like, share, and subscribe to the podcast wherever you're listening. And also, if you wouldn't mind dropping a comment to help with the algorithms. Okay, let's get started. I want to talk today in this episode on uneven healing for couples, where one partner grows faster than the other. It's something I see a lot in the work I do with my individual clients or with the couples that I work with. Sometimes they bring it up directly. Other times they bring it up other times they bring it up indirectly, but I will ask them about it because I think it's helpful to have a conversation. I wouldn't say that I see it more with one partner versus whether that's the one identified as having a sex addiction or the one with betrayal trauma, or in couples that I'm working with where addiction and betrayal trauma is not present. I wouldn't say it happens more with males than it does for females. But there is a moment where it becomes obvious that one partner has made some significant changes. Maybe they have become more aware, or they are more emotionally regulated, or they're more honest and transparent. And the other partner isn't quite there yet. Or maybe for whatever reason, they can't be there yet. And the question underneath the conflict that arises is, how do we fix this? Or are we still growing in the same direction? So today I want to talk about what happens when one partner appears to be growing faster than the other, and why this is actually very common, but can also be very painful, and how couples can navigate uneven healing without turning growth into a threat to the relationship. I want to state up front, this episode is not about blame, and it's not about choosing sides, who's doing recovery right. Instead, it's about how healing actually unfolds in real relationships and how to stay emotionally connected while change is happening. When couples tell me, or an individual client tells me that they're feeling their partner is ahead, what they usually mean is that one partner has more language. They have more insight, more emotional awareness. They're able to name patterns and start to set boundaries. And while that's good, insight or awareness is not the same as integration. Often insight comes before the nervous system can actually tolerate closeness, or accountability, or vulnerability. And when couples confuse awareness with healing, they start measuring each other in ways that can create shame instead of safety. I will often tell the person that I'm working with, or the couple that I'm working with, that it is very important as we engage in a healing process to keep in mind that growth is not superiority, that this isn't a competition, there's no emotional dominance, and to not weaponize therapy. And growth is also not a justification for pressure. Uneven healing is not a sign that something is wrong. It's actually the most predictable outcome of real change. Uneven healing is also not a failure of the relationship. People enter healing through different doors. It might be a crisis that brought them in. It might be longstanding trauma that they are aware is interfering with their current life. There may be a loss that they've experienced. Some people enter healing out of personal curiosity. And sometimes they enter because of an ultimatum. I've had people in my personal life, and I've even had extended family members ask me, doesn't somebody have to be ready to start the process of healing? And I will usually say, yeah, to a degree, readiness matters. I've also had I've worked with clients who are in therapy. They're not ready to change. They're not there because they want to be there. Maybe they just want to keep their marriage together, but they're not actually looking for personal awareness, and they're not in a place to do deeper work. I have said before that I think a good therapist can meet a client where they are and start to move them to the point where they can be open to a change process and shift into being ready to work. But if I'm being honest, I've also had clients where that's just not happening. And I will have a conversation with them about what's happening in our sessions. I've said to clients before, therapy is not just a place that you come to once or twice a week. Therapy is actually a process that you have to engage in. And I'll even bring up, I'm in this ethical dilemma because what I've observed is that they are coming to therapy to pacify their spouse. Their spouse may think, okay, at least they're going to therapy. But I'll say, you and I know nothing's really happening here. You come in, you talk to me, you bullshit me, and then you leave. And nothing gets different outside of my office. I'll even point out, when you have this many hours in a week and only one of those is spent with me in therapy, that is not going to lead to any meaningful change. And sometimes we'll decide it's better to take a pause because they're not ready. And I don't shame them into this. I may say, look, you're not working, you're not engaging, you're spending time and you're spending money, but you're not actually getting anything for that. And I'll ask them, what is the honest thing to do here? Is the honest thing to continue to come and spend an hour with me and pay me money to do nothing to make your wife think something's happening? And I'll be clear with them. If you find that you get to the time where you're ready to engage in the work, reach out to me. Let me know and I'll get you back on my schedule. Because ultimately, healing unfolds at the speed of regulation, not a spouse's desire. And not just because of willpower. A nervous system that is still in survival mode or in active addiction cannot integrate change on demand. You can't incite your way out of fear or resistance, and you can't will your body into safety. So all of that is real and all of that happens. But in this episode, I want to focus on the process of growth and healing for a couple where both are involved in a process of change and healing. They're both engaging. They both are here because they want to be. And the healing process is still uneven. For the partner who feels like they're growing faster, the internal experience often sounds like, I'm doing all the work. I'm not even recognizing my partner anymore. And they often wonder, am I outgrowing this relationship? There's also grief that's there and fear, and sometimes moral superiority disguised as self-respect. For the partner who feels behind, the experience is often one of shame, a fear of being left, a fear of feeling constantly evaluated or watched, and feeling like love has become conditional. When couples don't name this openly, they can slip into a parent-child dynamic where one partner becomes the evaluator and the other becomes the failure. That dynamic will kill intimacy and often widens the gap between them. In betrayal, trauma, and sex addiction recovery, uneven healing is almost built into the process. One partner may be working on accountability, behavior change, gaining insight, and getting traction with sobriety, where the other partner is working on reestablishing safety in their nervous system. They're working through grief. They're testing their reality, and they're relearning to trust themselves. Those are not parallel tasks. So when a recovering partner says, I'm doing the work, why aren't you better yet? What they're really saying is, I don't understand the tasks that you're working on for healing. And if it's the betrayed partner that's pressured to catch up, it can often recreate the original injury, in that they're being asked to override their own reality for the sake of the relationship. Let me share an example that captures how uneven healing can quietly turn into coercion, especially in betrayal trauma recovery. Years ago, I worked with a betrayed partner whose spouse struggled with sex addiction. For years, since the early days of their marriage, he had been highly critical of her body, commenting on it, criticizing it, shaming it, subtly and not so subtly blaming her for his acting out. And it's important to say here that she was not neglecting herself. She exercised regularly. She was in good shape. She was in good health. She was a personal trainer, ran marathons. She was physically strong and capable. But this wasn't about her body. It was about his relationship to intimacy and closeness. In my clinical opinion, he wasn't able to be in a real mutual relationship because fantasy had become safer than reality. So after years of criticism and shaming, she decided to put a boundary in place. I want to be clear, this boundary came from her. If I remember correctly, she came into a session and she was talking about how in the mornings when she showered, first of all, she was conscious of when she would get in the shower and what he might be doing. And then she hurriedly showered, got out and hurried and got dressed, hopefully before he came to their bedroom or in the bathroom. And as she was telling me about this, I said, it sounds like you're trying to create a boundary. But I wasn't sure if she was actually aware of it. And as we talked about it in the session, she said, yeah, I am not comfortable being naked in front of him. I don't want him to see me naked. But she also wasn't sure if she could have that boundary. And knowing their history, I said, I think it makes sense that you need this boundary. I think it's a fair and reasonable boundary. Her boundary was not coming from control and it wasn't coming out of punishment. It came from self-protection. And I think her body was trying to get her brain to be aware of something and not be in this subconscious conflict anymore. And that was, she didn't feel safe when she was naked in front of him. Months went by, and she came into session one day, visibly distressed, and told me that her partner had asked her to come to a session with him and his therapist. And that in that session, the partner's therapist had suggested that she needed to allow him to see her naked again. I don't remember all the details of what she told me about the session, but I remember that she said his therapist had said, maybe talk to your therapist about EMDRing this. And when she came into our session and was telling me this, I paused. I slowed down because this is the point where uneven healing can become dangerous in therapy. So I told her three things. The first was, that's not how EMDR works. EMDR is not a tool for overriding boundaries or pushing your readiness. Number two, that recommendation crossed into a boundary violation, and that therapy should never be used to pressure someone, especially into sexual exposure, after years of body shaming and betrayal. And number three, even if I technically had that kind of power to change that, I would deeply question the ethics of doing so. Because her discomfort wasn't pathology. Her discomfort and her boundary was not a problem. It was information. From the outside, it could look like he's doing his recovery. He's in therapy. He wants intimacy back. And that she's the one who's stuck. Or even that she's punishing him. But if we only looked at it from that perspective, that framing would completely miss the truth of what was going on for her. Her healing task was restoring bodily safety after prolonged relational trauma. His healing task was learning accountability without entitlement, without the control of saying when her boundary would change. Their tasks didn't match, and those timelines do not match. So the core issue for this couple was timing versus safety. If she isn't comfortable with him seeing her naked, then the work is not forcing timing, removing boundaries, or treating her nervous system like an obstacle that we have to overcome or we have to trick into being somewhere it's not. The work is creating enough relational safety, repairing years of harm, and allowing her body, instead of his comfort, to decide when intimacy would be possible again. Growth that demands access isn't actually growth. And recovery that would bypass consent is not recovery. This is what uneven healing looks like when it goes really wrong. When one partner's progress becomes a reason the other person is expected to hurry. Or when therapy language is used to justify pressure. And when a goal of safety is treated as negotiable. And this is why naming this and respecting pacing really matters. Because healing work doesn't ask, how do we get back to normal? It asks, what does safety require now? When growth becomes uneven, what's actually threatened is attachment. The deeper fears sound like, if I don't change fast enough, I'll be left. Or if I slow down, I'll disappear. If I need too much time, I'm too much. Competition and pressure don't create closeness. Instead, it creates performance. And performance will not get them back, will never get a couple to intimacy. I've mentioned in recent episodes that men often have a steeper learning curve when it comes to emotional intelligence. And when I say that, that's not a judgment. It's a reality shaped by how most men are socialized. But emotional literacy is only one piece. Other gendered patterns often show up when one partner appears to be growing faster. Again, these are patterns. They're not rules. They're about conditioning. They're usually not about character. So when growth becomes uneven, both partners are often colliding with old conditioning, not new problems. In many heterosexual relationships, men still hold more structural or emotional power, even unintentionally. And that power can show up as who decides when things should be better, whose discomfort gets prioritized, and whose growth defines progress. When the more powerful partner sets the timeline, uneven healing can become coercion, often without anyone intending it. What I do find in gendered patterns is that women often do the deeper relational work first. They're usually the first ones to enter therapy. They usually can more quickly name relational patterns, explore childhood trauma, question family and faith narratives. And they're often the ones who first feel the cost of staying emotionally disconnected. So it can look like women are growing faster, when what's actually happening is they've been carrying the emotional labor all along, and they're finally refusing to do it alone. When one partner appears to be ahead, it is worth asking, who was allowed to be emotionally underdeveloped without consequence? Who had to adapt early to survive the relationship? And who learned to tolerate discomfort and who learned to escape it? When we talk about socialized messaging that women get, many women are conditioned to prioritize harmony, to manage the emotional climate, to minimize their own needs, and to push past their own discomfort for the sake of the relationship. So when healing is uneven, women often ask, am I being too much? Am I expecting too much? Should I be further along by now? Am I the one holding us back? Even when their hesitation is rooted in very real trauma or exhaustion. For women raised in religious patriarchal systems, assertiveness was often framed as dangerous, morally, relationally, and even spiritually. So when women begin healing, they often feel a dissonance. On the one hand, they can see how traditional gender roles harmed them. And yet they still feel comfort in parts of those roles. Not because they want oppression, but because those roles once offered safety, predictability, and belonging. Empowerment isn't just about learning skills. It's unlearning the belief that having a voice makes you unsafe. As they heal, many move toward personal empowerment. They find their voice. They begin questioning old gender roles. They step into feminism, not as ideology, but as lived self-respect. And I find at the same time, they still want their partner to speak for them. They want their partner to set the boundaries they need to set. And they want their partner to take relational responsibility on their behalf. That can look confusing on the surface. It can even sound contradictory. But I don't know that it is. It's something we definitely have to name and put on the table to talk about. What I find often is there's a fear that empowerment is the same as emotional isolation. But empowerment does not mean you do everything alone. It doesn't mean you never need support, or that you're always the one who has to speak up, or that you are carrying the relational labor forever and always. That wouldn't be empowerment. That's just another version of overfunctioning. What many women actually want and need to move toward is interdependence. For many women, especially in long-term heterosexual relationships, their growth involves letting go of self-silencing, releasing hyper responsibility, and no longer managing everyone else's egos or comfort. But none of that erases the need for a partner who can share the emotional load, who uses their voice in shared systems and takes public or interpersonal accountability. I often find what women are looking for, but maybe they don't have the wording for, is a request for shared power. And I think there's a crucial distinction between wanting to be rescued and wanting your partner to have your back. Being rescued says, I can't handle this. Having your back says, we're a team and you're willing to stand with me. As I work with my female clients on connecting to their own sense of empowerment and then how that fits into their relationship, often women find that they're not asking their partners to replace their voice. They're asking them to use their male voice as a backing for their voice, especially in situations that involve in-laws, other friends, faith communities, or social systems where the male partner's voice carries more weight. Now, for male partners, this request can feel like, why do I have to do this now? Doesn't empowerment mean you do this? Or there's a feeling, or there's a question that comes up, why can't you just say it? What actually is being asked by the female partner is, will you stop benefiting from my silence and start sharing the cost of connection? Feminism, let me put this in a feminist reframe. Feminism in relationships isn't about women becoming independent of men. It's about men becoming accountable partners. And empowerment and women's empowerment doesn't remove their desire for protection, advocacy, or solidarity. It removes the assumption that women must provide those things alone. So if we go back to the dissonance that women often feel, they start to see clearly how traditional gender roles harm them, how silence costs them their safety, and how compliance erased parts of themselves. And at the same time, they still feel comfort in some of those roles. Not because they want oppression, but because the roles once offered predictability, a sense of belonging, a sense of being chosen or protected. and it offered some relief from relational responsibility. The dissonance isn't, I want patriarchy back. It's, I don't want to lose safety while I reclaim my voice. And for women raised in patriarchal faith systems, assertiveness doesn't just feel unfamiliar. It can feel dangerous. Speaking up often triggers feelings of guilt, fear of relational rupture, fear of being too much, and fear of losing love, community, or God's approval. So empowerment isn't just learning skills. It's unlearning the belief that having a voice makes them bad or unsafe. And then starting the process of rebuilding a relationship with God, a relationship with a community that also honors their voice. And that takes time. And this is where it can often get misunderstood. Women who are connecting to their sense of empowerment often still want their partner to lead with them. That takes time. And it's a negotiation progress. They're trying to separate the parts of traditional roles that felt containing from the parts that silenced and harmed them. And that separation is messy. It's also deeply healthy. Where couples often get stuck is when one partner hears empowerment as rejection, or the other person hears partnership as dependence. There can be old religious messages that go unnamed. Safety can be confused with submission. And without language for this, both partners feel wrong. The real question isn't, do we keep traditional roles or reject them? It's, how do we create safety, voice, and shared responsibility without asking one partner to disappear? Healing and growth doesn't require choosing between empowerment and connection. It requires defining both. Empowerment that costs you connection isn't freedom. And connection that costs you your voice isn't love. Now, when we talk about gendered patterns for men, often I will say pretty directly to my male clients that many men were not raised to see their partner as a partner. They were raised to see her as a supporter, a stabilizer, a moral compass, or just an extension of their role. So when she becomes more autonomous, more vocal, more differentiated, it can feel like the rules changed and no one gave them a manual. And while that confusion is real, it doesn't mean the work stops. This is actually where the work begins. And the shift is not one-sided. When a woman becomes more empowered, more assertive, more boundaried, it doesn't just change her. It changes the relationship ecosystem. Many men raised in the same systems were not taught to see their partner as an equal emotional authority. They were taught to lead, to protect, to provide, but not necessarily to listen. So when their partner begins to speak differently, or to assert her needs, or to challenge old dynamics, it can feel like a loss of a role that they had, a loss of predictability, and even a loss of identity. And because many men weren't taught how to name vulnerability, their fear can often come out as defensiveness, withdrawal, or resistance. Many men are raised with the expectation, even though it's often unspoken, that discomfort is something that needs to be solved quickly. So when growth feels uneven, it can show up as impatience, frustration, wanting a timeline, or asking, how long is this going to take? They've been taught that progress means resolution, not endurance, not the process. And in relationships, this can turn into pressure instead of presence. Not because they don't care, but because listening wasn't framed as masculine or necessary for them. In uneven healing dynamics, I often see men receiving validation for learning language, where women are being expected to be patient and understand. So male insight often gets rewarded, while female nervous system repair gets rushed. But insight without integration doesn't equal safety. And enduring without choice is never healing. But the attachment fears getting activated is a real thing. Men can feel like she doesn't need me anymore. I'm failing. Or a confusion about who they're supposed to be now. Sometimes it can also feel like a piling on of, oh, this is another way that I hurt her. And so that fear comes out sideways because they just weren't prepared that that was part of their healing process. But patriarchy doesn't just silence women. It limits men. It narrows men's emotional range. It outsources relational labor to women. It rewards authority over curiosity. And it frames listening as weakness. So when men are asked to listen without fixing, or to speak up for their partner in these very systems, to hold boundaries with others, and to share emotional authority, that might initially feel clumsy. They might feel exposed. And often there's a fear of getting it wrong. Now, that's not a reason to avoid it, but it can often explain their resistance. Growth for men in this phase often looks like learning to listen without interpreting it as a failure. It requires them letting go of that role-based identity and developing emotional fluency later in life. It also looks like allowing their partner's empowerment to inform, not threaten, their own personal empowerment. The shift is from I lead and you follow to we influence each other. And that's not a loss of masculinity. It's actually an expansion. When men adapt to their partner's empowerment, one of the deepest fears that I hear is that they lose their usefulness. But what they gain isn't that she needs them. What they gain is that she chooses them. Needing them can come from fear or it can come from dependency. But choice comes from safety, comes from desire and respect. And being chosen day after day is a deeper form of intimacy than being needed ever was. And here's the other side. When women have voice, when they have autonomy and empowerment, and their partner isn't threatened by that, they actually don't pull away. They often become more connected, more alive, and more present. Empowerment doesn't reduce attraction. In many relationships, it increases it because safety plus autonomy creates desire. And the relationship moves from, I need you to survive, to I choose you because I'm whole. That's not distance. That right there is intimacy. And it deepens the connection in the relationship. And it's a whole different approach to sexual intimacy. So let's bring this back to the topic at hand, uneven healing. Uneven healing isn't about one partner being ahead. It's about both partners outgrowing a system that never taught them how to be equal partners. And when couples understand that her empowerment isn't abandonment and his confusion isn't not caring, they can stop fighting with each other. And they can focus on dismantling what shaped them. Uneven healing here is not about speed. It's about taking the time to redistribute responsibility. And that redistribution initially can feel destabilizing before it starts to feel fair. Empowerment isn't about standing alone. It's actually about knowing and feeling that you don't have to. So if we bring it back to the relationship, the goal isn't for one partner to slow down or to speed up. It's for both partners to understand how socialization shaped their coping, how power affects their pacing, and how safety, not insight, creates intimacy. Growth is not about who learns faster. It's about who can stay accountable without becoming defensive, and who can stay boundaried without becoming invisible. What couples miss when they're afraid of this shift, or they resist the transition, they often believe they're protecting connection. But what they're protecting is familiar roles, predictability, and power structures that once felt safe. What they miss is the opportunity for mutual desire, for shared authority, emotional reciprocity, and a relationship that's built on choice, not obligation. When a woman no longer has to shrink herself or manage her partner's ego, soften her own truth, or carry the emotional labor alone, she can show up more fully. And when a man learns that her strength is not rejection, but invitation, something shifts. For couples that I'm working with where there's uneven healing that happens, I will ask them a question to reflect on and for us to continue talking about. For male partners, I'll ask them to reflect on this question. Can I allow my partner's empowerment to deepen connection instead of threatening it? And can I let being chosen replace being needed? For female partners, I'll ask them to reflect on the question, can I trust that my voice and autonomy does not make me unlovable? And can I allow desire to grow from safety rather than self-erasure? Now let's talk about what harms versus what helps when healing is uneven. What I've seen that really harms the relationship can be keeping score or comparing timelines and encouraging a competition. I also see couples use therapy language as leverage. Sometimes when I'm talking with, if they're working with one of the individuals in the partnership and I'm working with one, or sometimes I'm not working with any of them, but two of my colleagues are working with them. And it becomes a conversation amongst colleagues of, I feel like our clients are using us for leverage in their conflict. And usually we just need to put that on the table with the client and clarify what's happening, why they feel the need to use their therapist as the ultimate resource instead of communicating themselves to be heard. So I've seen before where it can also be harmful when boundaries are treated as just obstacles to overcome. And the boundary is consistently pushed and the individual tries to work around the boundary instead of respecting it, maybe asking for clarity on why the boundary needs to be there, what the goal is in setting the boundary. I find that when we treat boundaries as just obstacles, there's often some fear that they're assuming this boundary is here because they don't love me anymore, or I've caused so much damage that this boundary is going to be how the rest of our relationship looks. And sometimes when I'm working with a client who is on the receiving end of a boundary, their strategy is to just white knuckle and get through. And usually I will say, look, your partner's boundary gives you an opportunity to look at and work on some things too. And they can confuse that their discomfort is actually danger. So what helps when couples are in an uneven healing process? I find that it's often helpful to name the gap without blame. Just name it. Like right now in our individual work, it's taking us on paths that seem really far apart. And we have to believe that eventually these paths are going to come back much closer and parallel with each other. It helps to stay curious instead of trying to control. It helps to let grief and growth coexist. And it gets helpful to understand that trust often lags behind changed behavior. So you can change your behavior, and it can still take a minute for trust to catch up to that. And then the last thing I would say that is helpful during uneven healing is regulating with your partner, not ahead of them, because that would feel like weaponizing where you are against where they are. So instead, we have to regulate with our partner. Sometimes I'll use the analogy of any track at a high school. Often, you can go in the early morning hours of the summer or when school is in, you can see people walking the track or running the track. It's for exercise. And I'll say, let's say that you and I show up to this local high school and there's a handful of people out walking the track. And I lean over and I ask you, who's ahead? Who do you think's winning this? I mean, we could point to the person who at that moment is ahead, but we don't know that they're actually ahead. They might be lagging far behind. And I'll say, yeah, that's like growth. We don't know who is actually where, who's ahead, who's behind. And that's not what matters. What matters is we're working the same track. And sometimes you might look up and see your partner behind you. Sometimes you might look up and see your partner ahead of you. That doesn't really mean anything, but that's not dangerous. That's just how healing and growth happens. So can relationships survive uneven healing? Yes, when both partners stay engaged in their work and they stay accountable and curious. But no, they can't survive uneven healing when growth becomes control or when responsibility is avoided entirely. And sometimes healing doesn't save the relationship. It clarifies it. I've worked with some couples where they decide to end their relationship. And the goal becomes a healthy divorce and healthy co-parenting. And that doesn't mean healing failed. When uneven healing shows up, it's not just personal, it's patterned. And understanding those patterns helps couples stop blaming each other and start seeing what actually needs caring for. So if healing feels uneven in your relationship right now, keep this in mind. Growth isn't a competition, and it isn't a verdict. Uneven healing often surfaces old systems, including gender roles, faith messages, attachment wounds, and fears about being needed or being left. For some, the fear is, if I grow, I'll lose the relationship. For others, it's, if you grow, I'll become unnecessary. But healing asks a different question. Not, do you still need me? But can we choose each other freely, honestly, without shrinking? Because the deepest form of connection isn't built on dependence. It's built on mutual choice. Healing doesn't ask us to outrun our partner. It simply asks us to stay relational while we both become more ourselves. If this episode brought something up for you, I would encourage you to sit with it, talk about it, definitely get support. But remember, you don't need to rush clarity. You can't force alignment. Healing happens at the pace of safety, and safety is always worth protecting. At the end of this episode, I want to remind you that your story matters. Remember, there's something meaningful in every chapter. Don't wait to share your story until it's finished. Until next time, Jackie.